I need to tell you something. And I need you to hear all of it, every single piece, before you decide what kind of woman I am. Because by the end, you'll want to judge me. You might even need to, that's fine. I've been judged by people far more powerful than either of us in rooms built for that exact purpose. Courtrooms, boardrooms, church pews. But I need you to hear the whole thing first. Because what happened at that bank on October 14th, what they did, what I discovered afterward, changed the course of my life, changed the course of an entire town, and unburied a secret that had been rotting in the ground for 43 years. It started with a door. A glass door with brass handles, right there on Main Street in Ridgefield, Tennessee. Population 8,000 and some change. The kind of town where people still wave from their porches, but only if they recognize you. The kind of town where the courthouse clock hasn't worked since 1997, but nobody's fixed it because the people who make those decisions are too busy deciding other things, like who matters and who doesn't. I walked through that door at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. I was wearing flat shoes, a navy blouse, and no jewelry except my mother's watch. I didn't look like a CEO, I know that. I looked like what I am underneath everything, a 56-year-old black woman from the south side of a town that never wanted to remember I existed. The branch was Consolidated South Bank, corner of Main and Persimmon. I knew the building. Lord, did I know it. My grandmother used to clean the floors of this building when it was still called Whitfield Savings and Trust. She scrubbed those floors on her hands and knees for 22 years. I'll get to that. When I walked in, there were 3 employees visible. A young teller behind the counter, couldn't have been more than 23. A middle-aged man at a desk near the window, probably a loan officer. And standing near the back hallway, holding a coffee mug like she'd been born with it fused to her hand, was the branch manager. Susan Whitfield Price. I recognized her before she recognized me. Or rather, she didn't recognize me at all. I walked to the counter. The young teller looked up. Her name tag said Kaylee. She smiled the way people smile when they're trained to smile, mechanical, pleasant enough. "Good morning," I said. "I'd like to speak with the branch manager, please." Kaylee glanced over her shoulder toward Susan. Then she looked back at me, hesitated. "Do you have an account with us?" "I'd just like to speak with the manager," I said again, calmly. "Ma'am, she's in the middle of something right now. Is there something I can help you with?" I said, "No, I need to speak with her directly. It's regarding the branch operations." That's when Kaylee's smile thinned. Her eyes dropped to my shoes, my blouse, my hands, which had no rings, no manicure, no indication of the kind of authority that makes people in small banks sit up straight. She picked up the phone and whispered something into it. A moment later, Susan Whitfield Price walked toward me. She was 61 years old. Gray blonde hair pulled into a clip, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked exactly the way I expected her to look, like a woman who had inherited her position in this town the same way she inherited her jawline, without earning either one. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her tone wasn't rude. Not yet. It was something worse. It was the tone of someone deciding, in real time, how much of their patience you deserved. "My name is Denise Holloway," I said. "I'm here regarding an internal review of this branch. I'd like to sit down with you privately." Susan didn't blink. She tilted her head slightly and folded her arms. "I'm sorry, are you from corporate?" "I'm the CEO of Pinnacle Equity Holdings," I said. "We completed acquisition of Consolidated South Bank's parent company 6 weeks ago. I'm visiting several branches this month. Yours is one of them." There was a silence. Not a thoughtful silence. Not the kind where someone processes new information and adjusts. This was the kind of silence where a person has already decided you're lying and is now choosing how to make you feel that. Susan smiled. "I see," she said. "Well, I wasn't informed of any visit, and we do require advance notice for audits or inspections. So I'm going to have to ask you to contact our regional coordinator and schedule something formally." "I wasn't conducting an audit," I said. "I was introducing myself." Well, she said, I appreciate that, but I can't just let anyone walk in off the street and access branch operations. I'm sure you understand. Anyone. Off the street. I understood exactly what she meant. The lone officer at the desk, I later learned his name was Robert Gaines, looked up. He didn't say a word, but he watched. He watched the way people watch when they want to see how something plays out without getting their own fingerprints on it. I'm not asking to access branch operations, I said, keeping my voice even. I'm asking for a brief meeting, 15 minutes. And I'm telling you, Susan said, that without prior authorization, I can't accommodate that. If you'd like, I can give you the number for our regional office. She reached for a business card on the counter, slid it toward me like she was sliding a tip across a diner table. Is there anything else? She asked. And that right there is the moment most people think the story begins. The moment of disrespect. The moment of refusal. They think I pulled out my phone, made a call, and the whole place came crashing down like a house of cards. But that's not what happened. What happened is I stood there and felt something I hadn't felt in 30 years. I felt like I was 12 years old again, standing at this same counter, waiting for my grandmother to finish mopping the hallway, watching white men in ties walk past her like she was furniture, like she was part of the building, no different from the baseboard she was cleaning. I felt that, and I stayed calm. Because this wasn't about emotion. This was about something far older and far heavier than emotion. This was about a debt, a wrong, a lie that had been told so long, the people who told it had forgotten it was a lie. I took the business card, I looked at it, then I looked at Susan. You're Thomas Whitfield's granddaughter, I said. Her face changed. Excuse me. Thomas Whitfield. He founded this bank in 1961. Your father was David Whitfield. Your mother was Carol Ann Petties, who married your father in 1978. You grew up at 412 Birch Hollow Lane. You've managed this branch since 2006. Susan took a step back. How do you? I know because I grew up in this town, I said. On Delancey Road, in the yellow house with the tin roof. My grandmother was Ruth Holloway. She cleaned this building every night for over 2 decades. She cleaned it when your grandfather ran it. She cleaned it when your father ran it after him. And she cleaned it on the night she collapsed in the supply closet with a stroke, and no one found her until the next morning because no one thought to check. Kaylee's hand went to her mouth. Robert Gaines set his pen down. Susan said nothing. I'm Denise Holloway, I said again, and I don't need your regional coordinator's number. I own this bank. Now that moment, the look on Susan's face, I wish I could tell you it felt like victory. I wish I could say I stood taller, breathed deeper, felt the full weight of justice settling onto my shoulders like a crown. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like standing in a cemetery. Because everything that led me to that counter, every degree I earned, every company I built, every acquisition I closed, every sleepless night I spent staring at spreadsheets in hotel rooms in cities that didn't know my name, all of it traced back to one woman. Ruth Holloway. My grandmother. And she never got to see any of it. Let me go back, because you need to understand what was taken before you can understand what I came to reclaim. My grandmother raised me. My mother, Joyce, left when I was 4. I have one memory of her standing at the kitchen sink, humming something low, her back to me. That's it. That's the whole archive. She left Ridgefield and didn't come back. I heard she ended up in Memphis. Then I heard she didn't. Then I stopped hearing anything. My father was never a topic of conversation. Not once. Not ever. Grandma Ruth was everything. She worked 3 jobs, the bank cleaning at night, laundry service for 2 families during the day, and alterations on weekends for the dry cleaner on 5th Street. She fed me, clothed me, walked me to school, checked my homework, braided my hair so tight I could feel it in my sleep. And she never complained, never once. But she carried something. I could see it. The way she'd go quiet sometimes. The way she'd look at the Whitfield house when we drove past it. The way she kept a shoebox in her closet, high shelf, behind the quilts, and told me never to touch it. I touched it once, I was 14. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated March 1981. The handwriting was shaky, formal, the kind men of a certain generation were taught in school. It was from Thomas Whitfield. And it said, I am paraphrasing from memory, because that letter is long gone now. It said that in recognition of Ruth Holloway's years of loyal service and personal sacrifice, he was making provision for her in his estate, that she would receive the deed to the house on Delancey Road, which he owned through a holding entity, and a sum of $40,000 to be paid upon his death. $40,000. In 1981, for a black woman in rural Tennessee, that was a life. That was a future. That was a granddaughter who could go to college without selling everything they owned. Thomas Whitfield died in 1983. And Ruth Holloway received nothing. The will was contested by David Whitfield, Thomas's son, Susan's father. He hired an attorney named Gerald Peck, old family friend, deacon at First Baptist, the kind of man who could ruin your life and still pass the collection plate on Sunday morning with clean hands. Gerald Peck argued that Thomas had been suffering from diminished mental capacity in his final years, that any provision made for Ruth Holloway was the product of confusion, manipulation, or undue influence. Undue influence. A 60-year-old black housekeeper with no attorney, no savings, and no connections, accused of manipulating one of the wealthiest men in the county. The case went before Judge Franklin Coulter. It lasted 2 days. My grandmother testified. She sat in that witness chair in the Ridgefield County Courthouse, the same courthouse I'd walk past every day on my way to school, and she told the truth. She said Thomas Whitfield had promised her. She said he'd written it down. She presented the letter. Gerald Peck called it unverified, said anyone could have written it, said there was no proof of Thomas's signature, said Ruth had access to the house and could have forged it. My grandmother, the most honest woman I have ever known in my life, was called a forger. Judge Coulter ruled in favor of the Whitfield estate. The provision was struck from the will. Ruth received nothing, not the house, not the money, not even an apology. She walked out of that courtroom holding my hand. I was 6 years old. I didn't understand what had happened, but I remember the way she gripped my fingers, not tight out of anger, tight out of something worse. She was trying not to disappear. After the ruling, things got harder. The Whitfields informed my grandmother that the house on Delancey Road, our house, the only home I'd ever known, was their property, and they intended to sell it. We were given 60 days to vacate. Ruth found us a rental on the other side of town. Smaller, damp in the winters. The kind of place where the landlord shows up only when the rent is late, never when the roof leaks. She kept working, kept cleaning, but something in her had shifted. The quiet she carried turned heavier. She stopped humming while she cooked. She stopped going to church for a while, the first time in her life. And she never talked about the Whitfields again, not once. But she kept that shoebox, high shelf, behind the quilts. When she had the stroke, I was 17. I'd already been accepted to Middle Tennessee State on a partial scholarship. I was supposed to leave in August. She collapsed in June. They found her in the supply closet at the bank building, the same bank we're talking about, at 6:15 in the morning. She'd been there since roughly 10 the night before. 8 hours on a cold tile floor with no one checking on her. She survived, but she lost the use of her right side. Her speech came back slowly, partially. She could say my name. She could say water. She could say no. But the conversations, the stories, the way she used to talk me through a recipe or a problem or a heartbreak, that was gone. I deferred my scholarship. I stayed in Ridgefield. I took over her cleaning jobs. I worked at the diner on Route 9. I bathed her, fed her, read to her. And every night, before I turned off the light, she would look at me with her left eye. The right one didn't track anymore, and she would say one word. Go. She wanted me to leave. She wanted me to get out of Ridgefield. She wanted me to become something that this town would never allow her to be. She died on February 11th, 1992. I left Ridgefield on February 14th. I have not set foot in that town again, until October 14th of last year. 31 years. I won't take you through every year between then and now. You don't need a resume. You need to understand one thing: everything I built with her hands in mind. Every company I acquired, every deal I closed, every time I sat across from men who underestimated me because of my face, my gender, my voice, I thought of Ruth. Pinnacle Equity Holdings started as a consulting firm I ran out of a one-bedroom apartment in Nashville. It became an investment group, then a holding company, then something larger. We acquired regional banks, insurance firms, small hospital networks, commercial real estate portfolios. I'm not telling you this to impress you. I'm telling you because when I walked into that bank in Ridgefield, I wasn't posturing. I wasn't bluffing. I owned it. Legally, financially, and in a way I'm still trying to understand spiritually. I owned the building. My grandmother cleaned on her knees. And the granddaughter of the man who stole from her was standing in front of me, telling me to call the regional office. After I identified myself, the branch went quiet. Susan didn't speak for almost 30 seconds. That's a long time when you're standing 4 feet from someone who's just realized they've made a mistake they can't undo. Kaylee excused herself. Robert Gaines suddenly became very interested in his computer screen. Susan finally said, I didn't receive any notice of a visit. You weren't supposed to, I said. This wasn't an announced review. Well, she said, straightening her posture, trying to reassemble her authority like a house of cards in a draft. I was simply following protocol. We have security procedures. You understand. I do understand, I said. I also understand that 2 white men walked in before me this morning. One in jeans and work boots. One in a baseball cap with a fishing logo on it. Neither one was asked for ID. Neither one was questioned. Neither one was told to call the regional office. Susan's mouth opened, closed. I have security footage access for every branch in this network, I said. I reviewed it on the drive here. I watched how your team greets customers. I watched who gets the smile, who gets the pause, who gets the business card slid across the counter. I let that settle. Then I said, I'm placing this branch under operational review, effective immediately. You can't just. I can, and I am. Operations will be suspended as of close of business today. All staff will be reassigned pending the completion of a full compliance and conduct audit. You're shutting us down, Susan said. Her voice cracked on the last word. I'm protecting the institution, I said, and the customers you're supposed to serve, all of them. I turned to leave. And Susan said something that stopped me at the door. This is about your grandmother, isn't it? I turned around slowly. You think I don't know who you are, she said. Her voice had changed. It wasn't defensive anymore. It was something rower. You think I don't remember? My father talked about Ruth Holloway. He said she tried to steal from us. He said she manipulated my grandfather. That word again. Manipulated. 40 years later, and the story hadn't changed. The lie hadn't even been updated. It was the same script, passed down like china and curtains and the family name. Your father lied, I said. My father was protecting his family. Your father stole from mine. We stood there, 2 women, 2 generations deep in a wound that neither of us had made, but both of us carried. The glass door between us and the street was the only thing separating this moment from every person walking by on Main Street. I said, I'll have a formal notice sent by end of day. And I left. Within 48 hours, the story went public. Not because I wanted it to. I hadn't called the press. I hadn't posted anything. I hadn't even told my attorneys yet, not the full story, just the operational review. But someone inside the branch talked. Kaylee, I think, or maybe Robert, within a day. There was a story in the Ridgefield Courier. New bank owner shuts down Main Street branch after alleged discrimination incident. Alleged. That word does a lot of heavy lifting when people don't want to say what actually happened. By the end of the week, it had been picked up by Nashville outlets, then regional news, then national. And the narrative split. The way narratives always do when a Black woman exercises power in a space that wasn't designed for her. Half the people said I was brave, overdue, righteous. The other half said I was vengeful, that I had engineered the whole thing, that I'd walked into that branch looking plain on purpose, that I wanted to be refused so I could justify the shutdown. As if a woman needs to manufacture discrimination in a small southern bank. As if it isn't sitting right there, embedded in the carpet, soaked into the walls. Susan Whitfield Price gave an interview to a local station. She sat on her front porch, her husband beside her, and said, and I'm quoting this exactly, I treated her the way I would have treated anyone who walked in without an appointment claiming to be in charge. This isn't about race. This is about protocol. Protocol. The last refuge of people who want to discriminate politely. My legal team filed a formal civil rights complaint with the EEOC within 10 days. We also initiated an internal investigation of every branch in the network. Hearing practices, promotion records, customer complaint logs, service patterns. What we found was not surprising, but it was documented now. And documentation is the difference between a feeling and a case. In Ridgefield specifically, the data showed that Black customers waited an average of 11 minutes longer for service. That loan denial rates for Black applicants were nearly 3 times higher than for white applicants with comparable credit profiles. That in 12 years of Susan's management, not a single Black employee had been hired for a customer-facing role. Not one. In 12 years. In a town that is 31% Black. 3 months later, I was sitting in the Ridgefield County Courthouse. Same building. Same hallway my grandmother walked through in 1983. Same wooden benches, same fluorescent lights that buzz like trapped insects, same portrait of Judge Coulter on the wall near the clerk's office. He'd been dead for 15 years, but his face still hung there, watching. The complaint had evolved into a formal hearing. Susan Whitfield Price had filed a countersuit alleging wrongful termination and defamation. She claimed I had used my position to target her personally because of a family grudge. And here's the thing that will keep you up tonight. She wasn't entirely wrong. Not about the discrimination. That was real. The data proved it. The footage proved it. The patterns proved it. But was I there that day because of her? Because of her family? Because of what they did to Ruth? If I tell you no, I'm lying. If I tell you yes, I'm giving Susan exactly what she needs to invalidate everything. So I sat in that courtroom and said nothing. My attorneys handled it. I sat with my hands in my lap and my grandmother's watch on my wrist, and I listened. Susan testified first. She sat in the same chair my grandmother sat in. The same chair. I checked. The courtroom had been renovated in 2004, but they kept the original witness box. Same oak frame. Same slight tilt to the left where one leg is shorter than the others. Susan said she had followed standard procedure. She said she had not been informed of any ownership change. She said she had asked for identification, the same way she would have asked anyone. She said she had offered to connect me with the regional office, which was the correct escalation path. She was composed, practiced, she had rehearsed this. And then my attorney, Margaret Chen, stood up. Margaret is 5'2". She wears her hair in a bun so tight it looks like it's holding her entire skull together. She speaks softly, softer than most attorneys, and she has a habit of pausing before her most devastating questions, the way a surgeon pauses before cutting. Mrs. Price, Margaret said, you stated that you follow standard identification procedures for all visitors claiming authority over branch operations. Is that correct? Yes. In your 12 years as branch manager, how many unannounced visitors have you received from corporate or ownership entities? Susan paused. I'm not sure of the exact number. Would you say more than 5? Perhaps. And how many of those visitors were asked to call the regional office before being granted a meeting? Another pause, longer. I don't recall. I have records from your own email server, Mrs. Price. In 2019, a representative from First Continental, the previous parent company, arrived unannounced for a spot check. Male, white, no appointment. Your email to a colleague afterward described the visit as, and I'm reading directly, a nice surprise. Gary was lovely. We had coffee in my office and went over the numbers. Does that sound familiar? Susan's attorney objected. The judge overruled. Gary Pemberton walked into your branch without notice, Margaret continued. You offered him coffee. You sat with him privately. You did not ask him to call the regional office. Can you explain the difference between your response to Mr. Pemberton and your response to Ms. Holloway? Susan said, the situations were different. How? I knew Gary. He had been to the branch before. You knew him personally. Professionally. And Ms. Holloway, you didn't know her. No. Even though she told you her name. Even though she grew up in this town. Even though her grandmother worked in the very building your branch occupies. I didn't make that connection at the time. You didn't recognize the name Holloway. Susan pressed her lips together. Mrs. Price. There are a lot of people in this town. Your father sued Ruth Holloway in 1983, in this courthouse. Your family removed her from her home, and you're telling this court that the name Holloway didn't ring a bell. Susan looked at her attorney. He didn't move. I don't recall, she said quietly. Margaret let the silence sit. The courtroom was so still I could hear the clock on the wall, the one inside the building, not the broken one on the tower. Each tick was a small, steady accusation. I testified on the second day. I want to tell you that I was strong, unshakable, that I sat in that chair, my grandmother's chair, and delivered the truth like a hammer. But that's not what happened. What happened is I sat down, and I looked at the room, and I saw faces. People I didn't recognize. People I half recognized. A woman in the third row who might have been the daughter of my sixth-grade teacher. An old man near the back who could have been the mechanic who fixed Ruth's car that one winter. And I felt small. Not weak, small. The way you feel when a room full of people is looking at you, and you know that half of them have already decided what you are. Not who, what. Margaret led me through the basics. My background, my company, the acquisition, the branch visit, what was said, what was done. Then she asked me about Ruth. I told them about the cleaning, the 22 years, the 3 jobs, the stroke in the supply closet, the 8 hours alone on the floor. I told them about the letter, Thomas Whitfield's handwritten promise. I told them about the will, the contest, Gerald Peck, Judge Coulter, the ruling. I told them about losing the house, the yellow house with the tin roof on Delancey Road. And then Margaret asked me a question I wasn't prepared for. Even though she was my own attorney, even though we'd prepped for hours, she asked it because she knew it was the only question that mattered. Ms. Holloway, she said, when you walked into that bank branch on October 14th, were you there for business, or were you there for your grandmother? I looked at her. The courtroom waited. My mouth was dry. My hands were still. My grandmother's watch ticked against my wrist, measuring a silence I couldn't fill with anything except the truth. Both, I said. A murmur went through the room. I was there because I own the bank and I had every right to visit, I said. And I was there because my grandmother cleaned that building for 22 years and no one in it ever saw her. I wanted to walk through the same door she walked through. I wanted to stand in the same space. I wanted to be seen. That's not revenge. That's... I stopped. I was going to say justice, but that word felt too clean, too simple. It didn't account for the anger. It didn't account for the nights I'd spent in Nashville, then Atlanta, then New York, building and building and building. And never once asking myself what I was building toward because I was afraid of the answer. That's grief, I said, and it's the right to exist in a space where someone I loved was made invisible. Margaret nodded. Susan's attorney did not cross-examine me on that point. He was smart enough to know there was no winning follow-up to a woman saying she was grieving. But he found other angles. The cross-examination was clinical, precise, designed to make me look like a woman on a vendetta. Ms. Holloway, When you acquired Consolidated South Bank, were you aware that the Ridgefield branch was managed by a member of the Whitfield family? Yes. And you chose to visit that specific branch, personally, unannounced? Yes. Did you visit any other branches unannounced? Not yet. So the first branch you chose, out of 27 locations, was the one managed by the granddaughter of the man whose estate your grandmother contested. Yes. And you don't see how that could be perceived as targeted. I looked at him. His name was Paul Emerson, mid-50s, expensive shoes. The kind of man who builds his arguments the way masons build walls, brick by careful brick, and expects the structure to stand on its own weight. Mr. Emerson, I said, I visited that branch first because it's in the town where I was raised, because it's the building where my grandmother worked, and because I wanted to see firsthand how a branch in my network operates. What I found was a pattern of discriminatory service that your client oversaw for 12 years. I didn't create that pattern. I discovered it. But you were looking for it, he said. And there it was. The trap. If I said yes, I was biased, predatory. If I said no, I was lying. I was open to finding it, I said, because I know what this town is. I grew up in it. Paul Emerson paused. He looked at the judge. Then he sat down. That was worse than if he'd kept going. Because when an attorney sits down early, it means he already has what he needs. It means the closing argument is already writing itself in his head. The hearing lasted 4 days. 4 days of testimony, documents, data, and silence. The silences were the worst part. The moments when no one was speaking and the courtroom just sat there, breathing, like a living thing waiting to decide. On the 3rd day, something happened that I did not expect. A woman walked into the courtroom and asked to testify. She was not on either side's witness list. She was 78 years old. Her name was Elaine Burgess, and she had been Thomas Whitfield's personal secretary from 1974 to 1983. She said she had seen the story on the news. She said she had something to say. She said she'd been carrying it for 4 decades and she was tired. The judge allowed her testimony over Paul Emerson's objection. Elaine sat in the witness chair. She was thin, frail, wearing a dress she'd probably bought for church. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. She said that Thomas Whitfield had dictated the letter to Ruth Holloway in her presence. She said she watched him write it in his own hand because he said some things shouldn't be typed. She said he signed it. She said he told her to make a note in his personal file. She said she made the note. She said that after Thomas died, David Whitfield came to her office and asked her to remove the note from the file. And did you? Margaret asked. Yes, Elaine said. The courtroom inhaled. He told me it would cause problems, Elaine said. He told me his father hadn't been thinking clearly. He told me Ruth was, he used a word I won't repeat. He told me to remove the note and forget about it. And you did. I removed the note. I never forgot about it. Why didn't you come forward during the 1983 hearing? Elaine's hands tightened in her lap. She looked down. Because David Whitfield was my employer. Because Gerald Peck was my husband's attorney for our own property matters. Because Judge Coulter went to our church. Because I was afraid. She looked up. And because I told myself it wasn't my fight. That's the worst part. I told myself it wasn't mine to carry, so I let someone else carry it. And she carried it until it killed her. Elaine Burgess began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. She cried the way old women cry when the thing they've been holding finally breaks the surface, quietly, with a kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with the body. I sat in my seat, and I did not move. Because I was thinking about my grandmother, alone on that tile floor for 8 hours in the dark. Thinking about how many people in this town knew something, knew about the letter, knew about the will, knew about the theft, and said nothing. Did nothing. Told themselves it wasn't their fight. How many Elaines were out there? How many people watched Ruth Holloway lose everything and went home and ate dinner and slept in their own beds and told themselves the silence was neutral? Silence is never neutral. Silence is a choice, and it has weight, and it lands on someone. It landed on Ruth. After Elaine's testimony, the hearing shifted. Paul Emerson requested a recess. Susan Whitfield Price left the courtroom and didn't return for 2 hours. When she came back, her eyes were red. The judge called both legal teams into chambers. They were in there for 45 minutes. When they came out, Margaret sat down beside me and said, "They want to settle." Who wants to settle? Susan's team. They're offering to drop the countersuit. They're asking that the discrimination complaint be resolved through a consent agreement, operational reforms, bias training, community oversight board. And Margaret paused. They're also asking that you not pursue reopening the 1983 inheritance case. There it was. The real ask, buried under procedure and reasonableness, wrapped in legal language but naked underneath. They wanted me to let it go, again, the way Ruth was told to let it go, the way Elaine let it go, the way the whole town let it go. What happens if I don't accept? I asked. We go to full adjudication on the discrimination claim. We likely win. The inheritance case, that's more complicated. It was decided 40 years ago. Reopening it would require evidence of fraud upon the court, which Elaine's testimony supports but doesn't guarantee. It could take years. It could fail. And the house. The house on Delancey Road was torn down in 2003. The lot is a parking area for a dental office. I sat with that. The house was gone. The tin roof. The front porch where Ruth used to snap beans in the evening and let me sit on her lap even when I was too big for it. The kitchen where my mother stood at the sink, humming. Gone. Replaced by asphalt and a sign that says patient parking only. Some things can't be recovered. Some things can only be named. That night, I drove to Delancey Road. I parked in the lot. My rental car was the only one there. It was dark. The dental office was closed. The streetlights threw long shadows across the pavement. I got out and stood where the front porch would have been. I tried to feel something, the ground beneath me, the memory beneath that. I tried to hear Ruth's voice, the way she said my name, the way she said go. I stood there for a long time. And I thought about what Susan had said in the bank. This is about your grandmother, isn't it? Yes, it was. It was about Ruth, and it was about me, and it was about every woman who walks into a room and is told without words that she doesn't belong there, that she needs to call ahead, that she needs to wait, that her presence requires permission. It was about the fact that I had built a company worth more than every business on Main Street combined, and a woman behind a counter still looked at me and saw someone to manage, someone to dismiss, someone to slide a business card toward and send on her way. It was about all of it, and none of it was simple. The next morning, I went back to the courthouse. I sat down in my seat. Margaret was beside me. The judge entered, the room stood, the room sat. And the judge asked me whether I wished to accept the proposed settlement or proceed. I looked at Margaret. She gave me nothing. No nod, no signal, this was mine. I looked at the portrait of Judge Coulter on the wall. Dead 15 years. His eyes painted flat and certain, the way powerful men's eyes always look in portraits, as if they never once questioned themselves. I looked at Susan Whitfield Price, seated across the aisle. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at her hands. I looked at the witness chair. Ruth's chair. And I thought about something my grandmother said to me once. I was maybe 10 or 11, and I was angry because a girl at school had said something cruel about my clothes. I wanted to fight. I wanted to hurt her back. And Ruth sat me down at the kitchen table and said, "Denise, you listen. Hurting someone back doesn't fix what they broke. It just means there's 2 broken things now instead of 1. I believed her then. I'm not sure I believe her now. Because some things need to be broken open. Some things, systems, lies, families built on silence, need to be cracked apart so the truth can get air. But some things, once broken, can't be rebuilt, and you have to decide before you swing whether you can live in the rubble." The judge was waiting. Margaret was waiting. Susan was waiting. The courtroom was so still I could hear my grandmother's watch. Tick, tick, tick. Measuring time that didn't belong to any of them. It belonged to Ruth. I opened my mouth. And I need you to understand. I'm not going to tell you what I said. Not because I'm being coy. Not because this is a trick. I'm not telling you because I'm not sure, even now, that I made the right choice. And if I tell you what I decided, you'll judge it. You'll measure it against what you would have done. And then this becomes your story instead of mine. But here's what I'll give you. After the hearing, I drove out of Ridgefield. I took Route 9, past the diner where I used to work, past the church Ruth went back to eventually, past the turnoff to Birch Hollow Lane where the Whitfields lived in a house paid for with the comfort of other people's silence. And I pulled over. On the shoulder of the highway, engine running, hands on the wheel. Because I realized something I hadn't let myself see until that moment. Elaine Burgess, the secretary, the witness, she said David Whitfield used a word she wouldn't repeat. When talking about Ruth, a word so ugly she wouldn't say it in a courtroom 40 years later. But she also said something else, something I almost missed. She said Thomas told her, when he was writing the letter, that he was making provision for Ruth because of her years of loyal service and personal sacrifice. Personal sacrifice. Not professional, not domestic, personal. And I thought about my mother, Joyce, who left when I was 4, who Ruth never talked about, who simply vanished from the narrative like a page torn from a book. I thought about the timeline. My mother was born in 1960. Thomas Whitfield would have been in his 40s. Ruth would have been working in his home. I thought about what personal sacrifice might mean, coming from a man like that, in a time like that, in a town like that. I thought about why David Whitfield fought so hard to erase the provision, not just the money, the acknowledgement, the written record that his father owed something to this woman. And I thought about the thing I have never allowed myself to think about, the question I have never asked. Because some questions, once spoken, rearrange everything, every memory, every motive, every face you've ever looked at in the mirror. I sat on the shoulder of Route 9, with that question in my chest like a stone. And I didn't ask it. Not yet. But it's there. It's been there my whole life, I think, underneath everything I've built. Underneath the degrees and the deals and the bank and the courthouse and the parking lot where the yellow house used to stand. It's there. And one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe not, I'm going to have to decide whether I want the answer. Because the answer might explain everything. And it might be the one thing I can't survive knowing.